Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode is called The Man Killing Grizzly, known as Two Toes, and takes place in the still very primitive location near Yellowstone National Park. The year was 1912, and it was a bright, warm day in May near Crevice Mountain in southwest Montana. A 63-year-old prospector by the name of Johnny Graham was crossing the creek when his favorite pack horse stumbled. She fell flat on her side and had a hard time regaining her feet. Johnny pulled at the reins and yelled at her, "Come on, come on," trying to encourage her to get out of the creek. Finally, she stumbled from the creek and onto the bank, but was in terrible shape. Johnny looked down at her crooked leg and knew she was done. He sorrowfully marched her a few yards off the trail and pulled out his hunting rifle. The single shot dispatched her mercifully, as the old gold miner knew she would never recover from such a horrendous injury. A few days later, Johnny was returning from his claim to his cabin, a short distance from where he dispatched his pack horse, when he noticed the largest grizzly bear he had ever seen. He figured this big bear was headed to the remains of his pack horse and watched cautiously to see if his suspicions were true. He peeked through the willows and watched a robust and very healthy boar approach the horse carcass and start eating. Being a man of the backwoods, Johnny knew he was too old to stock up on a bear of that size, so he devised a plan. The next day, just after noontime, Johnny knew the bear would be full of horse meat from the carcass, so he carefully crept in and placed a large 60-pound bear trap near the carcass and stealthily crept away. He figured he would give it a few days and see if anything turned up in it. Johnny decided to swing by one day and take a look at the trap, and to his amazement, it was gone. The trap was heavily constructed of thick steel and featured jagged teeth designed into the metal. The trap's absence meant it was either stolen or the bear tore it loose and walked away with it still attached. Johnny began looking around to read the sign in the area and found some large bear tracks leading away and showing obvious signs of an impaired gait. Johnny warily followed the tracks a little over 200 yards down the hill. Amongst the trees, he saw the giant bear as he struggled against the trap. It was wedged between two fallen trees. Johnny thought quietly to himself how fortunate he was to have such an opportunity at a giant bear like this. He leveled his rifle at the bear and took careful aim. Johnny placed 2 shots to the bear's ribs, and the massive bruin collapsed and ceased all movement. Johnny triumphantly walked up to the trophy. He leaned his rifle against a nearby tree and unsheathed his skinning knife. This bear's hide was going to make a very nice rug for his den, he thought. As he approached the motionless bear, the massive bruin sprang to life. In a frenetic burst of motion, it tore itself loose from the steel trap, severing 3 of its toes. Johnny didn't even have time to turn to run, as the bear ripped into him, biting, clawing, and chewing mercilessly, but leaving him alive. The bear's severed toes and 4-inch claws remained behind as Johnny's only trophy, as the bear fled the scene. A short while later, a passerby found the miner in terrible condition and ran to get help after hearing the details of the encounter. The local miners and lumberjacks gathered together with their firearms and headed out to locate the bear before it could do any more damage to anyone else. The hunting party, hell-bent on revenge and eliminating the massive bear, pursued him until he crossed a raging river and entered nearby Yellowstone Park and its safety from hunters. Disappointed, the men knew what they risked had they pursued the bear into the park, and they turned back to check on Johnny. He succumbed to his wounds shortly thereafter. In 1960, Pat Welsh was delivering supplies near Soda Butte Creek, near Yellowstone. One night while sleeping, the 61-year-old woodsman was awakened by the familiar sounds of a bear in camp, raiding his supplies of ham and bacon. Welsh grabbed some pots and pans and clanged them together, trying to scare the bear off, as this wasn't exactly a rare event for the area. The bear was not at all frightened of the clatter, and actually advanced toward the man menacingly. Pat grabbed for the nearest weapon, an axe used for cutting firewood, and started swinging it to back the bear down. The giant grizzly easily swatted the axe from his hands, rendering the man defenseless, and proceeded to tear, bite, and claw Pat from head to toe. Pat's companion grabbed some Roman candles they had and chased the bear off. He tried to take care of Pat, but he succumbed to his wounds within a few days. His friend noted that after the attack scene was checked out in the daylight, the bear was missing 3 toes on his front foot. On the 12th of June 1922, a backwoods outlaw known as Frenchie was setting traps along Slow Creek, right outside of Yellowstone Park. His real name was Joseph DeRay, and he didn't really respect the law against hunting and trapping in the park, and pretty much did whatever he pleased. While checking his trap line one day, Frenchie noticed he had managed to catch a giant bear in one of his traps. He ran home to gather his hunting rifle and told his wife he'll be back by nightfall. He hurried back to the area but was caught off guard by the giant Bruin, who attacked the man and mauled him severely. Frenchie's rifle was found near the trap, and it could only be surmised that he was approaching the bear for a kill shot behind the bear's ear, but somehow he missed and the bear got a hold of him. The rifle's barrel had damage from the bear's teeth, and the stock had been torn in two by the angry Bruin. In the bear's hasty retreat from the scene of Frenchie's mauling, he departed with the trap still clinging to his leg and dragging the chain in the dirt behind. The trap was found about a year later, minus the bear it once clinging to. Old Two Toes was never heard from again. Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode takes us to the dense pine forests of the Slana River just north of the Wrangell-St. Elias National Park and Preserve in Alaska. Along the river is a broad valley in which the river winds and creates a vibrant riparian zone that allows beaver, moose, wolves, and bears to thrive. Though this area is crisscrossed by a few roads and dotted by roadhouses and tiny towns, it is remote. Stepping off of the established travel route places you in the middle of virtually uninterrupted forests and wetlands. In the early 20th century, only the toughest and most independent of souls would call this place home. On August 29th of 1949, an immigrant from Denmark named Knute Peterson spent 26 years of his life mining and prospecting the waters of the Slana River system for gold and uranium. That day he drove his truck down the road to his friend's cabin. Ole Hoagland was a trusted mining companion, and Knute was planning on visiting and asking his friend to go mining with him up the Big Talk River to the north. Knute parked his truck on the gravel highway and started walking down the trail to Ole's place. He had made this trip countless times and never had an incident that he couldn't handle. He hadn't brought his rifle and planned to stay the night at his friend's house before returning in the morning. After discussing the prospecting trip, Ole let Knute know that he simply couldn't go, as he had too much work to do. As Ole began his chores, Knute started the return hike to the highway, and his vehicle parked there. Knute returned on the trail, which was only a few yards from the river it followed. He was excited to get back and start preparing his equipment for his trip. He was a little over a quarter of a mile from Ole's cabin when he was terrified by a deafening roar from the willows behind him. For a moment he was paralyzed by fear, but soon turned in the direction the roar had come from. He was mortified at the sight of an 800-pound, enraged brown bear speeding toward him, eyes focused on him. The giant bear was infuriated and growled and snarled as it closed in on the petrified miner. Knute had seen bears run plenty of times, but the speed of this gargantuan Bruin amazed him and relayed the fury of the bear. Knute knew that he couldn't outrun the bear, but hoped that he could jump into the river right next to him. He quickly surmised a plan to hold his breath as long as he could as the muddy river waters hid his escape downstream back toward Ole's cabin. He could swim the rest of the way and the bear would soon forget about him. But that plan was far too ambitious. The bear caught him only a few steps into his escape. The brown bear slapped him on his left shoulder, knocking him flat onto his face in the gravel. The bear sank its 2-inch-long canines into Knute's left arm and bit it to the bone. The bite nearly severed his arm and rendered it useless in his defense. Knute flipped onto his back to try to kick the bear, but the beast immediately tried locking its jaws onto his face before he could react. Knute hollered as loudly as he could for Ole and slapped the bear across the nose with his right hand in a futile attempt to defend himself. The bear was so fast that it crunched onto his right hand and wrist before Knute could even pull his hand back. The bear then focused its attack on his right thigh and bit it to the bone as well. The bear's teeth tore and ripped his thigh like a knife through hot butter. It chewed on his thigh while holding him down with its left paw positioned on his gut, while the man yelled for his friend to help him. The bear next slapped Knute's left calf and ripped it wide open with a single swipe. It then flipped him over by digging its claws into his back and ribs, gashing flesh and skin alike. Knute tried to belly crawl into some nearby alder, but the bear slashed him on the back of his head, severing a 3-inch patch of his scalp completely. The bear then bit into his neck, and Knute could feel his vision fading as his air and blood supply to his brain was pinched by the pressure of the bite. The bite increased the blood pressure in his head so much that he could feel it. The next thing Knute could remember seeing was the bear's enormous mouth, as it again focused on his head. The bear clamped onto the lower half of his face and crushed his jawbone, knocking 4 teeth out with a piece of jawbone. It broke the upper plate of his dentures in two. The bite severed his nose and upper lip as well. The bear threw an absolute fit on the man, grunting and growling and huffing in rage for the better part of a minute. Then it disappeared. The silence was such a contrast to the noise of the attack that Knute was unsure if he was still alive. He sat there for a short time trying to gather the depth of what had just happened. He inventoried his wounds as best he could and was covered from head to toe in his own blood. His clothes were tattered, and the only section intact was his belt line and waist of his pants. All of his other clothes were torn from him during the attack. He was covered with cuts and gashes, and his right wrist was obviously broken. The meat of his right thigh was completely separated from his leg, but still scantily attached. His left bicep muscle was torn loose from his arm and rolled up toward his elbow. His face was an utter mess, and his windpipe was exposed from the bite to his neck. He wasn't sure if it was even possible to get back to Ole's cabin, and tried to crawl initially, but his broken wrist made it impossible. He struggled to his feet, but couldn't walk with his right thigh so severely damaged, so he sort of hopped on his left leg as best he could. As he staggered through the brush, his blood seeped from his face into his windpipe, causing him to choke and cough. He bent over trying to clear his airway of blood, but the blood from his face then flowed into his eyes, temporarily blinding him. He didn't care if the bear was following him or not, as if there was a subsequent attack, he knew he would not survive it. His best bet was to push on toward Ole's. As he approached Ole, he could see and hear his friend sharpening tools on a small grinder. He didn't want to startle Ole, but he couldn't speak, so he let out a grunt, which was drowned out by the grinder. He grunted even louder, and Ole turned around, and his expression told Knute everything he needed to know. Ole later would indicate that he only recognized Knute's eyes, as nothing else was familiar. As Ole stared at Knute, he muttered, "Oh, Christ, Knute, what happened? A bear?" Knute nodded his head and pointed to the cabin. His friend helped him inside and prepped a mattress for him to lay on. Knute tried to say goodbye to his friend, but couldn't utter any intelligible words due to the injuries to his face. Knute comforted his friend, grabbed his rifle, and left for help. Ole ran the mile to his truck on the highway and made it the 4 miles to the Alaska Road Commission camp within 17 minutes. Given that he was over 60 years old, he made amazing time. At the camp, the authorities were notified and a small rescue crew was assembled to save Knute's life. Back at the cabin, Knute stood to his feet and looked in the mirror. His face was sloughed over to the side, and he knew this was something that he wasn't sure he would ever recover from. He laid back on the mattress, but started to get cold from shock. He decided to light a fire in the wood stove, but the blood from his injuries continually extinguished the flame. He was so distorted he couldn't even smoke a cigarette. He tried to write a will and testament on a calendar, leaving everything to his brother Ole. Knute soon heard the voices of his rescuers outside the cabin. The men carried him on the mattress and put him in a boat to take him downstream closer to a road. The men carried him from the craft to a vehicle, and he used his hands to hold his face together enough to ask them if their efforts were even worth it. They reassured him that he would survive. An army doctor administered morphine just before they loaded him into a plane to fly the World War I veteran to a military hospital on Elmendorf Military Base in Anchorage. The men returned to the scene and found Knute's severed scalp, but it was beyond saving. 2 soldiers donated blood for Knute, and surgeons worked for several hours trying to patch him back together. The surgeons had to discard the portion of his thigh muscle that was torn loose, as it could not be salvaged. Dirt, pine needles, and bits of clothing were removed from his injuries before they sutured them shut with 418 stitches. Despite a grim prognosis, Knute regained the use of his right arm and his leg within about 4 years. He stayed in the hospital for 3 months, and his missing scalp grew a thin layer of scar tissue over it in about 2 years. It was frail and would be ripped open easily, but that was better than having an exposed skull. Knute was filled with a vengeance toward bears after that, and recommended that people shoot any bear that shows up around their cabin. The bear was a huge, healthy bear of undetermined sex, and the presence of cubs was never confirmed. The bear was not shot and remained unharmed to the best of the research I uncovered.
Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode takes place near Grand Mesa, Colorado, and is more of a story about a freakishly large bear than an aggressive bear. Old Clubfoot, as the bear had been known by, wandered the area dining off of local provisions that were not his own. He was a gentle giant, I guess, but didn't understand the implications of his gluttonous pursuits. In the 1880s, ranchers near Grand Mesa, Colorado, were noticing cattle that had been killed by a grizzly bear. The bear had always eaten his fill, then moved on, and never returned to the same place. He was a very large, smart bear, and hard to predict for the ranchers. In the year 1890, the bear was caught in a trap, which was the prevailing way to catch a bear long enough to be shot. The trapper would be permitted the opportunity to dispatch the bear while it was encumbered in the trap, limiting damage to the trapper. A large grizzly was caught in this trap and managed to get away, -3 of his toes. This identified the bear at all future cattle predation, as his signature two-toed track was present. His track resembled a club, and that was the origin of his nickname. In 1902, a small hunting party had decided to hunt near Grand Mesa, as was common at the time, as the fishing and hunting were excellent. Franklin Mangus, who was a spry 61-year-old man, decided to stay back at camp, as he was relatively new to hunting. Mangus took his .30-30 deer hunting rifle and stayed close to camp, looking for a deer for camp meat. Franklin was walking along a trail near camp when he heard a loud woof behind him. He slowly turned and felt the hair on the back of his neck stand erect. A very large grizzly bear was walking toward him in a non-threatening manner. Franklin froze in fear and wasn't sure what he should do. The bear peacefully strode past him, but when it was about 20 yards away, Franklin decided to shoot it. The report of the rifle rang out, and Mangus expected to see the massive bruin piled up. Instead, he watched as the big bear just ran off. Franklin knew he couldn't just leave the bear and started trailing the tracks. He followed the bear several miles and was crossing a stream to find the bear's tracks on the other side to continue the pursuit. Suddenly he saw the giant rise from the bushes a little over 100 feet from him on his hind legs. Franklin quickly shouldered his rifle and fired. The bullet found its mark in the bear's shoulder. He worked the lever on his firearm and fired again. At that point, the bear turned and retreated into the nearest cover of willow bushes. Franklin worked his way around the willow stand, and the bear exited just about 25 yards from him. The bear lowered its head and charged the man. Franklin worked the action of his rifle and fired as quickly as he could, dumping bullets into the bear to stop the attack. The bear fell and ceased its movement, and the hunter realized the struggle had ended, at least for now. Franklin left the location and returned to camp to tell the other hunters of the encounter. He ate dinner and discussed the bear's location to recruit help in recovering the animal for harvest. The recovery party hiked the long distance to the location Franklin indicated the carcass would be, but were surprised when they got there. The bear was gone. They started looking around the area to locate any sign of where the bear had gone and followed his tracks about 100 yards to a nearby willow grove. Franklin fired his 12th shot into the back of the bear's skull to finally bring the ordeal to an end. The remarkable part of the story is the reported size of Old Clubfoot. He weighed in at around 1,600 pounds, which is a gigantic bear for an interior grizzly. When the hunters looked his hide over, they counted 12 shots that penetrated his thick protective hide, but only 2 of the bullets penetrated the protective fat layer beneath his hide. Old Clubfoot's hide measured 8 foot 4 inches squared, which means from nose to tail and front paw to front paw. The massive bear's hide is still in the possession of Franklin's family and was temporarily displayed at various points of interest in surrounding towns, as well as the World's Fair in St. Louis in 1903.